Hey guys, Montel here, and welcome to this edition of Let's Be Blunt with Montel. My guest today received his undergraduate education at Cornell University, his medical degree at George Washington School of Medicine and Health and Sciences, and his residency and fellowship training at Harvard Medical School, Massachusetts, General Hospital, and the Brigham and Women's Hospital. He is a nationally recognized expert on clinical cannabinoid therapeutics and has chaired multiple national and international conferences on the use of medical cannabis for therapeutic purposes. He is an anesthesiologist and a pain management physician, having been in the military and private and academic practice for over 35 years, and is also the chief medical officer for Acreage Holdings. Dr. Burchman, thank you so much for joining us today here at Let's Be Blunt, sir.
Thank you for having me, Montel. I appreciate the opportunity to talk.
Absolutely, and I appreciate having you here on the show because it's we try our best to see if we can dispel some myths and give our listeners as much information as they can absorb to help them navigate this really almost daunting landscape of cannabis in the United States of America and also worldwide. So let's start before you go into what you're doing with cannabis now and in the last couple of years. Let's go way back. Why don't you tell me a little bit about your background? Where did you grow up?
I was born in the Bronx and moved shortly after that to the D.C., Maryland area, where I went to high school. And
Maryland boy. I'm a Maryland boy, but I was born in Baltimore, and I went to high school in Andover High School in Linthicum, Maryland. Were you in Maryland, or were you?
I was at Montgomery Blair High School in Silver Spring, but lived in Owings Mills for a little while, so I'm familiar with the Baltimore terrain as well.
Gotcha. And growing up in that area, typical high school?
Yeah, nothing particularly dramatic. I was always interested in science. I was pretty much a science geek in high school. Played soccer, ran track. Nothing particularly remarkable. Stayed out of trouble.
When did you start to think that, man, maybe I graduate, I'll go to college and see if I can become a doctor? When did that come up?
That's really interesting. I thought about that. When I was living in the Bronx, I was very close to my grandparents, and my grandfather was suffering from COPD. I remember vividly, I think at the age of 5, I was at the Bronx Veterans Hospital, and I saw him suffering in sort of his last gasping days. And even at that young age, I was just fascinated by the physicians and the clinicians and how they would take care of patients. And I had an aptitude for science and biology growing up, and I think I would pretty much from an early age, I thought about healthcare.
Gotcha. And then you went ahead to graduated from high school. Did you go straight to college, or you go to the military first?
No, it's interesting. I was interested growing up in Maryland. I had a lot of exposure to the Naval Academy. I was really interested. In fact, I got a congressional appointment, and I was going to go there. But I was really interested in neurobiology. And Cornell had one of the best sort of brain science programs in the country, and I opted to go there. But I was always interested in the Navy, and I did a little ROTC in college. And then when I found that I was going to head to med school, I couldn't pay for it, and I joined the service, and that's a whole different track. And I know that you and I share that path as well.
We discussed it before. I mean, same thing as you. Growing up in the Maryland area, I grew up in Anne Arbor County, just 25 miles from, 20 minutes from the Naval Academy. So, but I also, like you in some ways, I really didn't consider going to the academy at first. I was very much involved in student politics and stuff like that when I was in high school, and goofing around a lot, playing in a band, and then when it came time to when I graduated from high school, I got several scholarships and was capable of going to school, but I just opted to enlist in the Marine Corps instead. So I enlisted in the Marine Corps, and as soon as I got away from Marine Corps boot camp, my first duty station, my chief NCOs were saying, well, why are you even here? You should be, you should be an officer. And I was like, well, why do you think that? And they said, well, you ever heard of this place called the Naval Academy? I said, that's right down the street from where I live. The next thing you know, I'm off to the prep school and then off to the academy, and I graduated. So you joined the service. And I will tell you, part of the reason why I did join the service is that I had a scholarship. It really wasn't like a full load scholarship. So I didn't really have the financial wherewithal to go to school. So I thought, well, let me go in the service first, get the GI Bill or get, some money in my pocket. Then I could go to college. But then I ended up going, 2 years after I graduated and went on and got commissioned as a naval officer. You went to undergrad, then you went on active duty?
Correct. Well, no, actually, then I went to med school. I got out of college in 3 years, and I just sort of had a year of living in my parents' basement,
Gotcha.
which was a trip. But I really couldn't afford med school. I got into GW, which was probably one of the more expensive ones in the country, but opted to go there because I liked the DC area and I had friends and family there. And I loved it. I never looked back. So I matriculated just as a regular civilian student, but I was actually a member of the armed forces at that point. So they gave me full freight, which was fantastic. And then, of course, I had obligations to the service following graduation.
So then you started as a doctor in the Navy.
Correct. I did my internship at Oakland Naval Hospital in the Bay Area, and then I was actually deployed on active duty for about 2 years on a ship. So I was on the USS Roanoke, which was an oiler with the Carl Vinson Battle Group out of Alameda. And I remember, and these were the days of long cruises. And we left in, I think, July and came back the following August. So
What year was this?
This was like 1984.
You know what? We have so much in common because I got to tell you, I remember, when I graduated from the academy in '80. I did we were the first battle group. I was on the Kitty Hawk battle group in the Indian Ocean. And we were one of the first battle groups post Korean War, World War II, to actually get beer at sea. Because we did I did 180 days in the IO.
So you had a beer X.
I had a beer X.
Yeah, so I lived through two of those.
I lived through two of those too. It was really crazy. Did it a second time. It was really crazy. I was on another deployment after I graduated the academy, and I graduated cryptologic school. I was on a destroyer and this was really crazy, in Central America. I graduated from the Defense Language Institute in Russian, got put on a destroyer, had to go do a Central American mission with all Spanish linguists rather than Russian linguists. And then
sounds like the Navy.
Sounds like the Navy, right? Then we ran through the Panama Canal to become a part of the battle group that invaded Grenada. So by the time we hit the Grenada, we were already out at sea for like 187 days.
Right.
And it was so funny. My team got pulled onto the island off of the ship that I was on. And then when we came back, they had already had their beer. And the captain was like a stickler to regulations. You guys deserve 3 beers. If you want your beer, here's what I'll do. He put his dinghy in the water, pushed us back from the boat on a cord, and we sat there and drank our 3 beers or 2 beers.
That's great. That's great.
It was
I drank our share in the Indian Ocean, probably 1,000 miles from Diego Garcia. But, we were in the Persian Gulf on and off continuously through the early 80s. And it was a great experience. I was ship's doctor probably for 1,200 men. And it was, you know what it's like. It was just a great experience. Great people. I had a huge amount of respect for the line, the real Navy. And it's stayed with me. And we'll go through that later as to what I'm doing with the veterans now.
Sure. And I'll share some stuff that I'm working on, because I think we'll probably have some synergistic places that we might be able to regroup a little later on about. Now tell me, after you spent how many years in the Navy?
Well, I had 13 years in, but part of that was education. And then I went on, I served at a naval hospital in Puerto Rico for several years as an anesthesiologist. After my deployment, I went back for training. I got lucky enough to hit a residency in Boston, and I did some fellowships there, and then went back in the Navy as a trained anesthesiologist.
And you got out officially came on active duty when?
I think probably 1991.
Gotcha. That's almost the same time I did. That's when I transitioned over and started my career in television. So then where did you go when you got out?
It's interesting. I ended up in Baltimore because, I was overseas. I was deployed. I was an active duty service member, and I knew I wanted to be somewhere on the East Coast, and it was just easy to get an academic job. So I actually worked at University of Maryland for a year. I was the chief of anesthesia at one of their hospitals in Baltimore, and I lived in
Wow.
Owings Mills. It was great. It was a very interesting experience.
My sister was employed by the University of Maryland at that time. As a matter of fact, she had a very lengthy full career at the University of Maryland. She was the head of purchasing as she was out at UMBC
Okay.
at that time. Um, so and you spent your time which hospital in Baltimore?
I was at Cornell Hospital,
Uh-huh.
which is on Security Boulevard outside of Baltimore.
Sure.
And I was there for a year, and I was sort of, I was a clinician. I like treating patients, and this was a little bit more of an administrative job for me. I didn't really love it, and I quickly transitioned to private practice and ended up in York, Pennsylvania, for I don't know 14 years or so, practicing clinical anesthesia.
Okay. And now, I mean, following that as a background, when did you become interested or when did you start thinking about cannabis, especially understanding your military background where it's completely frowned upon,
Oh
even
yeah.
CBD outlawed? Um, you
Right,
know,
you can hardly talk. You can hardly talk about cannabis actually in the Navy, and even today to some extent. But it's a great question. So I was practicing pain management as well as anesthesia, and I had a pretty busy pain practice in Southern York County, and just observational. And I'm a student of the brain. I studied for years, as an anesthesiologist, how drugs operate on the central nervous system. Really understand how analgesics work. And in the pain business, back in the early 90s, as you would probably recall, opioids was our mainstay. Montel, I was writing prescriptions for hundreds, if not thousands, of opioid pills in that decade. And it was the patients that came to me who were, struggling with use disorder and opioid addiction. And, Pennsylvania was not a medical cannabis state at all. But patients would tell me, I had a patient with prostate cancer. I could remember like it was yesterday how he was using cannabis to ameliorate his use of opioids. And I was fascinated by this, and probably one of the early sort of individuals looking at the science behind, well, why the hell is cannabis useful as a replacement as an analgesic? And that led me on a really interesting journey into the science of how the endocannabinoid system works, and how there is absolutely a parallel system within the body of analgesia using marijuana-like compounds that the body actually produces. And so that was really my adventure into the study of cannabis, because I was not a cannabis user, and
this is late 90s, early 2000.
probably the mid 90s.
Okay.
And by that point, not a lot of people were espousing the beneficent effects of cannabis, and I did a lot of lectures, I did a lot of regional, a couple of national lectures, and I became somewhat of a spokesman on like an early adopter to cannabis.
You were outlier. You were not just an early adopter. You were an outlier back then. You're talking about the early 90s. I mean, it wasn't until 1998 that the federal government filed for its own patent for a CBD and
Yes,
for cannabinoids, and they gave themselves a patent in 2001. As a matter of fact, the published data that Meshulam was coming up with in the early 90s that was paid for by us,
right.
our taxpayer dollars in Israel, really was it 93, 4 is when he first published some information. Well, they published the first round of information like in the late 80s about the endocannabinoid system, but it went right over everybody's head. Then they republished again in the early 90s, and then people finally said, oh, what is this thing? But here it is now. We're sitting here at 2022, and we still have doctors going, what is this thing? Are you
Oh
kidding
yeah.
me?
It's so true. I was appointed by the governor of New Hampshire to be on the therapeutic cannabis oversight board. And part of that is talking to physicians all over the state. And I talk nationally as well in my other gig with Acreage. But the point is exactly to your point that cannabis is still a bit of anathema to a lot of conventional physicians. But the science is there, and it's growing weekly in terms of innovations and discoveries in terms of what, in fact, the endocannabinoid system is and how important it is to body maintenance.
I mean, I've so many, just in those three sentences and these three questions, I have so many questions. I'm trying to figure out which way do I want to go. Let's see. Let's start with this one. Let's just break that down. You were dealing and studying on your own, reaching out to do what doctors are supposed to do, and that's continuing medical education and making sure that you stay up with the current data. You just said
Right.
something else about we're finally getting the research done, but we know now that there are more peer-reviewed, published documents on cannabis than just about any other drug in the marketplace today.
Absolutely.
30-something thousand. There's more peer-reviewed, published documentation on cannabis and cannabinoids than is on aspirin.
Right. It's
alcohol.
You're preaching to the choir. I wrote an article on this, and I got so many hits and so many contacts by this article. As a physician, we are primarily interested in curated, what I call peer-reviewed data, and the great depository for that in the world really is the National Library of Medicine and a database known as PubMed, which is probably 30 million articles, 7,000 peer-reviewed journals. And if you look up cannabis in PubMed, you get about 34,000 hits. That's 34,000 published articles. And if you were to look up the number of articles on, say, Humira, which is the number one selling drug in this country, it pulled in $22 billion for Glaxo. I'm actually not sure who's making it, but the combined citations for Humira, Prozac, and Xanax, three of the biggest, and Tylenol, do not exceed that of cannabis in terms of research study.
Yet we still have doctors and politicians saying, well, when they finally get some research done, I feel like smacking them upside the head. What, stupid? Go look it up.
Oh my God, it's unbelievable. I have spoken to probably 15 state legislatures across the country, and the first question that legislators ask me is, well, there's no research on cannabis. Show me where's the evidence. And it's a bit of a slog, but the fact is that the research is coming. The DEA has awakened to the point where now they have sanctioned and registered private growers with research licenses, and so the research is coming. And we could fill an entire hour on the type of research and the conditions that have come from this.
I wouldn't mind. I mean, what do you think about recently? It was about last month, I think. There was 3 peer-reviewed published documents that talk about CBGA and CBDA having some effect on the spike protein of the SARS-CoV virus to block it from entering the cells.
Right.
I saw that and I was like, are you kidding me? How dare somebody say there's no research being done?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that was a very compelling article too, out of Washington State. Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
Yeah, I am. I think not probably as extensively as you, but I am a kind of a medical research geek myself. I kind of spend a lot of my time digging, trying to find information so that I can, like I said at the beginning of this podcast, I'm trying to educate my viewers as much as I can, and I'm really trying to uplift this country, because what we ought to try to understand right now, especially with America going through such a tough economic time that we're going through, we are just scratching the surface when it comes to cannabis hemp. We're like the Wright brothers pushing that plane down a tree. Push that plane down a hill, a wooden plane down a hill. There's so much more that's going to come out of hemp that we've already known. We knew this back in the 1590s when we used hemp, the hemp sativa plant, for everything from clothing to bricks to wood to rope to you name it. And a lot of people like to think, and I've come to this conclusion for myself, is that we like to try to believe that America was built on cotton and tobacco. Bullshit. America was built on hemp.
Absolutely.
If you were a farmer back in the 1590s, 1600s, you were considered, unpatriotic if you didn't grow hemp. If you, and multiple times along the way, our government has ordered and passed rules and regulations that farmers had to grow hemp. So it's so ridiculous that this is something that could, especially using the biomass, some of the leftover biomass from this human consumption model that we have. I'm involved in so many different things.
Let me interrupt for a second. This is
Sure.
such a great line of discussion. At the end of the 19th century, hemp was the number one agricultural product in the world.
Right.
All of the rigging of all the sailboats was hemp. The sails were hemp.
How about the word canvas really comes from cannabis? People don't
Yes,
understand that, right?
right. All
And
the
you also know that the Revolutionary Army was clothed in hemp fiber. George Washington was wearing hemp when he was crossing the Delaware.
right. Yeah, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, all on hemp paper. All of the impressionist paintings that we see in the museums throughout the world, from the early 20th and 19th century, all on hemp canvas. It's
Yes,
fascinating.
it is. And then let's go back to consumption. But our sailors out at sea ate a porridge of hemp seed because they recognized even back in the early 1600s that hemp had such a high protein content. And I don't think people want to remember that or want to think about that because they think, hemp seed don't get you high. It's not going to get you high because it hasn't developed and turned into THC yet.
Correct.
But that hemp seed has a protein level in it that most farmers, most people in America ate it on a regular basis, weekly. Along with oatmeal, they ate hemp meal.
Correct. Fascinating.
But then that also then makes you wonder when you think about how a race that wasn't as hardy as it is today when it comes to, we look at the differences in our life expectancy from 47 years back in, 1999 to now we're living to be 80 and a robust 80. And, but I often think it's like, how much more robust would we have been had we continued to consume cannabis and hemp as a food supplement throughout the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s? Would we be more, I don't know, will we be have more robust of an immune system? Because we know that the cannabinoids at all have a profound effect on our cellular homeostasis. And was it the fact that we had included that in our diets early on that, we don't know. I kind of chicken before the egg thing, but we don't know how pervasive some of the autoimmune diseases that we have today really were back then because they were not be able to diagnose them back then. But I don't think there was the same level of autoimmune disease in the 1800s as there have 1900s as there is now. Or what do you think?
Well, it's quite possible. I mean, the whole aspect of modulating immune function with cannabis is absolutely fascinating. I'm not so certain that hemp seed itself, which doesn't really have a storehouse of cannabinoids like the plant does and the flower does, but the point is that cannabis has been in continuous use for over 3,000 years. And as I like to tell legislators, it's actually the longest clinical trial known to man in terms of safety and efficacy. And it would be very interesting to see what sort of aspects of autoimmune disease occurred in a prior century as opposed to today, and what some of the modifiable factors are. But certainly, cannabis plays a large role, and I think the potential is very high.
I know you were very much involved with Acreage, but I mean, I would love to see a company, get one of those DEA authorizations to just study the seed itself. Let's find out why, when that seed starts to germinate at 6 weeks, it creates something called CBG, and that CBG then turns into CBD, THC. What's between nothing and CBG? There's something there. That's what I've always been thinking since, and I wish for an opportunity to be able to study that or get somebody to study that or fund a study on that to find out what is that in that seed that we don't really pay close attention to, because we all pay attention to once the germination starts, but something's going on in that seed before that.
I think that's fascinating. And actually, I have a lot of colleagues among them who have research licenses, and with my network of people in chemical analysis, I think that would be a really very interesting study. And no one's looking there. No one's really looking at the seed. I have to tell you that, except the genetics of it, because it has to do with growing male versus female plants. But
right. I think that's the only place they go, but they don't look at the value of that seed itself. And I think that's where, hopefully, I don't know, 20, 30 years from now, that's where I think the big bang is going to come from when it comes to
that's very exciting.
Yeah. So let's I'm sorry, I got us off track, but let's go back for a second. So you became interested in cannabis initially because of just, I guess, anecdotal stories from some of your patients that were talking about how they were helping to ameliorate not only pain, but some other symptoms. That got you interested enough to start the education process. And what did you do to educate yourself?
Well, as I mentioned, I used peer-reviewed journals, PubMed primarily. And because I'm an anesthesiologist and I think like one, I think in terms of drugs, activity, and therapy. And I realized, of course, from research studies, there are over 150 cannabinoids and over 500 active compounds, including terpenes that we could talk about. And we've really only identified a handful of them. And, I know that physicians recommend cannabis to patients all over the world. Patients take it for self-care, but there's no consistent dosage or mechanism of administration. And what possible way I was asking myself, how can we approach treatment success if we don't know which are the active compounds and what are they doing and how are they positively affecting the patient? And so I made it my study, my one of my major goals to learn about this more. And just culling the research. You can't go, and I tell lay people this all the time. You can't educate yourself on the internet. I mean, there's way too much misinformation, I should say. In fact, I wrote an article once called Miss Canna, which is the misinformation and disinformation associated with cannabis that advertisers and websites use as clickbait. And most of those are real myths. And I'm much more interested in curated, peer-reviewed information. And it's out there.
And yeah, you're right. It's out there. I mean, and again, I mean, most people, and I've had conversations as of late, and over the last 10 years with Dr. I was very fortunate. I got an opportunity to, back in 2011, go to Israel and sit down with Dr. Meshulam in his office, and I put him on tape. I couldn't use it, but I put him on tape, and we had a really long and robust conversation back then. And that's really when I think, became a zealot in trying to find out as much as I could find out. And, when you start talking to some people right now, again, you're right. They literally go up online, type in, get an article, clickbait, something comes up, endocannabinoid system. Oh, that's a good buzzword. I'll start using that buzzword. Then you ask them, what does that mean? And they don't even know that the two of the endocannabinoids, and we don't know what all of them are, the ones that we manufacture in our body, being anandamide and 2-AG, they don't even know what their purposes are. And I find it boggles my mind, Doc. I'm so sorry to say it. That I can sit down and have a conversation with a doctor who can't tell me what anandamide does. And
right.
I'm like, really? Are you kidding me? Is this this is how deep you dug? I mean, it took me 3 articles to figure it out, but I'm not a doctor. I only did 3. Doctors probably do 20, right? And
just in this brief conversation we're having now, I am absolutely convinced you know more than 90% of physicians about cannabis. I just the very fact that you know of the existence of the endocannabinoid system, about the endogenous cannabinoids. It's a bit of a slog for me to talk to physicians about it, because first of all, they have a lot have closed minds about it, and they don't want to do the work.
How do we let's stay on this for just 1 second. I mean, how do we think, because I mean, you take a look at the last 2 years, I think one of the biggest issues right now facing the cannabis industry in America and worldwide is lack of education on the part of those in business, We have become such zealots on B2B, trying to see if we can get our own little footprint here and there, but really kind of almost totally neglect educating the consumer. Because if you educate the consumer will drive the education of the doctors, I think. So I think it's incumbent upon our industry to do as much as we can to continue to give the viewer, like here on, let's be blunt, but viewers around the country. I mean, I think they need to have the information as a consumer so that, number one, they can navigate the space. If they decide to get involved in it, they can go to a dispensary or someplace and understand what they're actually looking for and asking for, rather than relying on some, 20-something-year-old bud tender who literally read one article and tries to regurgitate that back to them. I really think that it's incumbent upon this industry, especially right now. This is 2022. We should be doing this, put brakes on, stop trying to sell as much pot as we can sell and start trying to sell as much information as we can sell, because information is what's going to drive this over the next 20 years. But I say this, I feel like I'm screaming this on deaf ears in the industry when I go to some conventions and other things. It's like a waste of my time trying to get these people to educate people.
I absolutely have to concur. I think education and product sales should go hand in hand. Certainly, the medical cannabis market is more amenable and conducive to true patient education. But what's really interesting is that the adult use, or what we call the recreational market, those consumers are also, to a large degree, using cannabis as medicine. They're either using it for anxiety or for sedation or for appetite improvement. And don't even get me started on cancer therapy.
Doc, I got to tell you something. I agree with you 1,000,000%. I have said it. If you go back to any of these podcasts, you'll hear me say it over and over and over again. This whole idea of adult use or recreational use, I think, is a bullshit term to begin with. I think anybody who gravitates towards cannabis is gravitating towards cannabis because they have an underlying medical issue that they may not even call a medical issue. The person who says that I like to get a hold of some cannabis because it helps me sleep. Well, they have a sleep problem.
Correct.
That says, it makes me feel better than, because I get up in the morning without that headache, or I get up in the morning without having a hangover. I get it, because you're trying to reduce your anxiety when you come home. That's why you were drinking 5 glasses of wine, and you now figured out that one, half of the joint made you feel better than 5 glasses of wine. That's an underlying medical reason. And I think that's another area where we in the industry have done ourselves a disservice by buying into this idea of adult use or recreational use. We should be saying,
yeah, I hate that term. I hate that term. I do a lecture called "It's Not About Getting High," and I talk about microdosing THC. And you know who loves that lecture? The seniors. The largest growing segment of our population that is using cannabis, that are new users, is over 55, and it's all about
Exactly. You're nailing it. I'm literally, I think I want to make sure, Keith, I know you're listening to me, brother, but we need to make sure this podcast gets blown up 9 million times. Why? Back in 2011, Israel declared cannabis a geriatric drug.
Absolutely. And it is. It is. I mean, we could get into indications and diseases, but as you probably know, certain aspects of cannabis and cannabinoids are exquisite anti-inflammatory medications. And so for the relief of joint pain and arthritis, as well as other immunologically and inflammatorily mediated illnesses, which is right up the alley of any senior citizen, cannabis is in proper dosage is absolutely indicated. And in terms of safety, far and above, more safe than non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs that cause bleeding disorders, or opioids, or other potent agents that can cause cognitive problems. Even though I'm not practicing medicine per se, I get a lot of calls, and I just discussed care in a 94-year-old gentleman with severe spinal stenosis, couldn't even get out of bed. And I started him on microdose THC. And I was really worried because he was on Eliquis, which is a blood thinner. But with appropriate management and supervision, this guy has got his life back. And I know these are anecdotes, and I know physicians, they can't stand anecdotes. It's not robust data. But to me, anecdotes are the test studies for research. Those are the pilot studies that push you into asking the right questions, that serve up sort of these clinical double-blind trials, which we're not able to do in this country to any extent with cannabis.
If we were to collect the data from doctors all over the country, you'd probably find out that these anecdotes are at least 20 to 30 to 40 to 50,000 individuals strong. So when does the anecdote not be an anecdote? You just said, when is the
Oh,
anecdote
oh
no
no,
longer
this
an
is
anecdote?
well. This is. I'm sorry to interrupt. This is a
No.
great point. I wrote a grant to set up a huge national marijuana database, and I called it Data Jane, and it was really doing just that, extracting all the data points of using phone apps of all the patients, what they were using, what kind of weed they were using, what was the terpene mix, as well as their indications and their results. And only through the amassing of tens of millions of data points could we really assess and analyze where efficacy lies. And that grant did not go through, probably more for political reasons than any, but it will. I am absolutely certain it will. It's information forums such as this that helps propel this.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's going to come. I think it's going to, it's going to be a matter of getting, the word out. Again, part of that education thing. I'm down in Miami, Florida, and we're in the senior citizen capital of the world down here in Florida, and I say that jokingly, but there are so many people who are undercover cannabis users down here that and a lot of them are doing exactly what you say. They are microdosing. I mean, I think I came up with some products years ago. I was one of the first people, I think, I'm telling you, back in 2001 I was out seeking CBD laden cannabis when the majority of the growers in this country were trying to grow the CBD out of the cannabis. As a matter of fact,
Right,
I
right.
was able to get a hold of a couple of I've been a keef smoker since about 2001. I dabble in just a little bit of flower, but majority of what I consume and have to consume has either been keef or oil extracted from keef. And I remember back in 2001, 2002, I found a grower or two up in northern Humboldt County area that literally was saying, "I'll give you as much of that CBD shit as you want." And I mean, basically, I was getting some of that for free
That's
because they
great.
didn't want it because they couldn't sell it. And I was taking the CBD and then finding, a really decent strain that I liked that goes back my journey, and I think this is something else that we found with people who utilize cannabis for more of a medical purpose. Your journey isn't exactly 100% stable. Now it should be, but it's not. I mean, there was a while where I saw it very high CBD of say maybe 7 to 3, 75% CBD, 25% THC, where I would mix together. And then I started noticing that I felt a little bit better at a 101 when I was looking for the particular kind of relief. And then there was a period of time when I needed to go, a higher THC, not as much CBD, because the CBD was kind of making me a little bit cloudy and a little bit lethargic, whereas the THC literally kept me on my game, and
Right.
especially with dealing with and coping with my neuropathic pain. And then, in the last, I unfortunately suffered a pretty severe hemorrhagic stroke 4 years ago that should have killed me, but it didn't, and I'm glad it didn't. I'm now almost 100% recovered from that. However, but after my stroke, I started to notice that, I have a little difficulty if I don't really pay very close attention to what it is. First of all, let me say, I accept no cannabis from anybody. Nobody can walk up and give me a joint and say, "Hey, you want to?" No, I don't want to try it. I don't.
Sure. You
I
don't know what
only
it is.
Correct. I only utilize a cannabis or something that I made or helped formulate myself. And then if I didn't formulate it, then I always have on me, I always have, a little bit of CBD keef, a little bit of THC keef, high keef, and I can mix them together and elicit the response I want. But I've noticed in the last year, I have less of a tolerance for THC than I used to. the tolerance meaning what I want to experience from it. I don't need,
Sure.
my objective is not to get high
Of
and be
course.
blown away and not be able to think or get off the couch. My objective is to be able to function without me feeling that shit in my feet. And so, and the pain in my feet. And in order to do that, I got to kind of modulate. Now, I'm right now running about, again, I'm back down to about a 25% THC and a 75% CBD. And of course, the terpene mix is very important for me. And I put those together, and that seems to be my sweet spot. And I'm okay. And like, I so far today, most days, 5 years ago, I literally was a wake and baker. I mean, I had, a pipe beside my bed so that if I was kicking and having leg tremors at night, I could roll over, take a quick hit, go back to sleep. Now I don't even start, even until I take a lot of CBD. I've already taken my CBD this morning. I probably won't take my first hit of a cannabinoid with THC in it until 4 or 5 o'clock this afternoon. And when I do, I literally take such a small inhalation. It's really almost crazy. And it's an oil, a vapor. So I take a very small inhalation and I'm fine. And then I'll take a little bit more before I go to sleep. And that keeps me asleep throughout the night. And I'm on to tomorrow.
See, this process that you're talking about, of course, is titration, drug
Yeah.
titration, which is something we in anesthesia do all the time. We give a little bit of a drug to a patient, we see the effect, then we give a little more, and your process is extremely mindful and quite sophisticated, and I can totally appreciate it. Unfortunately, the vast majority of users don't titrate like that. And the reason it harkens back to what we said before, and that's education. They're not getting the education on how to use this medicine correctly, and that's really the key. And it takes help. It takes help. You can't really discover it on your own.
I agree with you, sir. And I mean, I think one of the problems has been, and when we look at COVID and we look at what's happened to now kind of segregate us, and now everybody's holed up in their home. They're having their cannabis delivered to themselves, and they're trying. Cannabis used to be something that was more of a social experience, and social in the sense of a couple of people might get together, and then you would judge in some ways. I hardly ever remember not being with 3 or 4 other people, and you consume, and then maybe later in that evening thinking about how this person responded versus the way that person responded. That's part of that collection of data that a person was doing without even thinking about it. Because
Right.
they know that Johnny passed out on the couch. Hell, I didn't take as big hits as he did, and they're doing a little bit of data collection while they were out socializing. Now people are buying stuff, having it delivered to their front door, not able to ever see the response that anyone else has had to it, not even being able to gauge what their response is to it. So yeah, I agree. I think that one of the things that's we are again so behind in, and that is even I would want to do it here on my website, but I can't on my podcast because if I light up right now and explain to people, well, let me show you this is the size of an inhalation that I may take off a vape pen, I'll get kicked off the site for 5 or 6
Right.
months. Whereas
Right.
if I was some stoner, I could sit here and smoke up and put clouds in the air, and they applaud the fact that 5 million people are watching put clouds in the air. It's just ignorant.
You speak to a larger point, and that is, I think a useful learning platform would be a titration school. I did something like this for a large senior expo in southern Pennsylvania, where there were 30,000 seniors that came to Reading, PA, to learn about all kinds of aspects, and I got to speak on the topic of cannabis. And I basically held a workshop, not in real time. I didn't light up a joint or do anything, but I explained in excruciating detail just what you discussed a few moments ago about you need to have a gauge on what the medicine is doing to you. And another point that's really confusing and somewhat confounding is that there's a lack of consistency of product. In other words, you may find something that works well for movement disorder or pain or spasticity, and then 4 weeks later, if you go back to that same dispensary or that same source, they may not have that strain. And
Or if they
that,
had the strain, if the strain was the second batch grown and it didn't grow out the same
It's
way.
right. It's totally different, and that's where I think pharma is someday going to come in, and we are going to pharmacologically, uh, not corrupt, but co-opt these cannabinoids into consistent doses, constituents that have similarity between doses, and I think that will go a long way towards more of therapeutic efficacy.
I got to tell you something, Doc. I've been trying to do this for now it's going on 16 years. I've been trying to get someone in this industry. I've now have found a partner in the Massachusetts area that my products will go back on shelves in Massachusetts here within the next month. I have had a CBD product that's getting ready to go back on the marketplace probably by the end of next month, a THC product that will go in the marketplace by the end of this month, where I've been doing just that. I literally, though I do like the whole plant composition, I do like to find if I get what I think are valid COAs where I can take a look at what's there and then formulate a higher level of certain terpenes and a higher level of, say, CBD. I put together a 25-75, a 50-50, and a 75-25 with particular terpene profiles in each one of them, that I'm hoping that as long as they're manufactured and meet those levels, the response will be the same every time you use them. That's what I'm trying to do. But again, feedstock is the feedstock. I mean, if I can't
Right.
find the exact same quality feedstock, I got to find something else to put in there to elicit that same response. And it's tough.
Right, and then the other issue, of course, is there's an aspect in medicine we call inter-individual variation, and that
Yes.
means that particular strain and compound of ingredients might work perfectly for you, but for
Correct.
another individual, it might blast them on their ass or not allow them to get out of bed. I know a woman who is in her mid 90s in a nursing home in upstate New York who takes a 40 milligram dose of THC every morning, which would knock the crap out of most people. But she's habituated to it. She's used to it. It's not a use disorder. She uses it for her Parkinson's disease, and it is quite successful. So there's an array of response based on that patient's own genetic makeup.
Absolutely. Well, talk a little bit about, some of the most recent research that you've come across.
Oh, okay. There's some really exciting things that are going on. Like, let's take pain, for example. Pain is probably the most common indication that medical patients use for cannabis. And, together with morphine, cannabis is probably the most common medicinal remedy for pain over the last several thousand years. And there's really good evidence now that cannabinoids prove very useful in the modulation of pain, that is, how pain is transmitted in the body. And research has demonstrated that there is this parallel system in addition to the opioid system. There's an intrinsic opioid system that controls pain. There's also an intrinsic cannabinoid system that controls pain. And just one example, THC and CBD and a couple of analogs of CBD have been shown, this is fresh research, have been shown that they inhibit the release of serotonin from platelets. And serotonin happens to be the neurotransmitter that is one of the causes of migraine headaches. It turns out it causes vasoconstriction in the brain, and in 1892, William Osler, who is like the father of the textbook of Western medicine, he came out with a statement that the best, the most effective treatment for migraines was cannabis indica. And so here we are 130 years later talking about using cannabis for migraines. And it's even hard in some states to get it as a qualifying indication. But there is excellent scientific, pharmacologic, molecular, demonstrable proof of its effectiveness. And that's just one aspect of research. Another, if I could go on for just a second, another
Sure.
really fascinating uh, research line is the autism spectrum disorder.
Yes.
Autism is a developmental problem. Its symptoms include impaired communication, social interaction, restricted or repetitive motor movements, and autism spectrum disorder has been addressed very well with some remarkable studies in Israel. And some really very interesting data, both anecdotal and hard science data are coming out. There's a brief anecdote, but it brings tears to my eyes every time I think about it. There's a woman I was working with in southern New Hampshire. She's the CEO of a major tech company in Boston, so very sophisticated woman. She has a nonverbal son who's now 17 years old, who had been on Risperdal and other, conventional meds that were just knocking the crap out of him. Really didn't do much for his autism except reduce his explosive behavior, but he was totally nonverbal. She started him on CBD about 2 years ago. It didn't really help, but she added low dose THC. And then they were sitting around, and she told me this story at a meeting of the New Hampshire legislature. They were sitting at the dinner table, and this kid is 17 years old, never uttered a word, but he's sitting at the table, and he says to his mother, "Could you pass the lasagna?" And the mother breaks down crying and says, "Can you talk? Can you talk?" And he said, he started to verbalize. And let me just go on with just the briefest story. He really didn't speak well, but he spoke briefly. They were at a wedding, and there was a toast to the bride and the groom, and the son was at the wedding, and he kept saying speech, speech, as if he wanted to give a speech, and he had never spoken before in public ever. And so with the bride's agreement, there were 100 people at this wedding. They handed the microphone to this young man, and he sang "Imagine" by John Lennon, which just blew the pants off the entire crowd. There was not a dry eye in the audience. Now, I know this is an anecdote, but it could be repeated 1,000-fold in terms of the lives that were brought back from very low dose cannabis in the autism spectrum disorder. And as I said, there is some really good demonstrable evidence that it has a role.
It's incredible. Well, Dr. Burchman, I'm almost out of time, my friend. I really have to have you back. Please, could I beg you to come back?
I thoroughly enjoyed our discussion, and there are so many points we didn't discuss.
Oh, we didn't get to leave.
It would be very useful to touch on it.
We were just scratching the surface, my friend. I think we could go and go and go and go, and I'd love to do that with you. So, let's plan on it. I will make sure our people reach out to you, and then whenever you have an opportunity soon, I'd love to have you back, because I'd like to hit my listeners and my viewers with, a couple doses of you, so they understand that, there are real, true pioneers out there, and you are one of them. If people wanted to reach out to you to get more information, is there a place they could go?
Well, I think I'll give you my email offline, and we could maybe discuss how people can get in touch with me.
All right, let's do that, and we'll put that up later after the fact. I'm going to say thank you. This has been an incredible conversation with Dr. Corey Burchman. I wish you so much luck in everything that you're doing. I hope that Acreage, can expand its footprint nationally and get more information out there. If there's ever anything I can do for you or help you get the word out, I'd love to help you and love to be by your side. We've spoken together once before.
Yes, we have. And I thoroughly appreciated the opportunity to help expand the knowledge base.
Absolutely.
Keep it up.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you all out there for making sure you tune into Let's Be Blunt with Montel. Thanks for joining me on Let's Be Blunt with Montel. Please make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell to be notified when new episodes post each week. We'd love to hear your feedback also, so please send us your comments.